That's a nice view on the bay there.
Prey is one of the best immersive sims to come in the last decade. Developed by Arcane Studios in Austin, Texas, it has no narrative relation to the 2006 Prey game, and is more of a spiritual successor to the cult classic System Shock. When researching this game, I found out there's a reboot of System Shock coming out next year, so that is something to look forward to. Hopefully I get this out before then, but we'll see. Prey had a bit of a bumpy development, as it was supposed to be a Prey 2 based on the original Prey, but instead of a sequel, we get a spiritual successor, which is still a sequel, it's just for a different game. We'll not be comparing the stories because I haven't really played System Shock 2, but I will one day. There are not too many of these type of games made anymore due to the cost and complexity of their development, so the list of actual games to have been released in this genre is rather small. Pretty much only the Dishonored games and Prey. There's a couple others with the tags, but I really wouldn't call them immersive sims. While it's great that we get a bunch of choices, the average person is going to approach a problem in a very straightforward way, missing out on a lot of other paths. In our late-stage capitalist society, the extra development can be viewed as wasted labor. Prey had the luxury of being built within a closed environment that just really needs to be filled up rather than an open world where it's part of a larger landscape. Each room on Talos has a purpose, so there's a reason to explore it. Many of the characters have relationships with one another, but since we only run into a few of these people alive, we get to listen to their stories through emails, audio logs, and environmental storytelling. This works really well for the story of Prey given the plot. There are a lot of places I could start the story, but let's go back to what started it all to give context. Prey takes place in an alternative timeline, one in which the space race saw an emergence of orbital space stations sooner than our own. The Soviets, being the winner of the space race, found a species of huge social aliens, later named the Typhon, aboard one of their satellites in 1960. Used social animals organize their social structures like bees and rats and naked mole rats, just so you get some context to what that means. In 1962, the Soviets secretly approaches the USA for assistance on containing the Typhon. The then President John F. Kennedy agreed, and later they were able to capture and cage them in a space station they built in cooperation. Because of a failed assassination attempt on John F. Kennedy in Texas, the USA took full control of the station from the Soviets. Guessing it was assumed that they were the ones who made the attempt, similar to how it was in our own timeline. In 1980, there was an incident which caused the scientists aboard the station to lose their lives to the Typhon, and in response, the government shut down the project, but left the Typhon alive. And none of this, of course, was public knowledge. The scientists have us do various things, expecting different results than what we're showing. So we're moving blocks out of a circle quickly, trying to hide in an open room, jumping over a barrier, and using a computer. They have us do the trolley problem with the added Fat Man dilemma. This test is more important than it seems since it's reflective of the overall game. We also do the Rorschach test, but it really isn't important since it's interrupted by a creature changing into a coffee mug, then killing the doctor. The image of the apparent Rorschach test isn't exactly random. Now, the image is supposed to be a Typhon or something like that, but I'm not exactly sure which type of Typhon it is or anything of the sort. The doctor kind of getting killed is his own fault in some way, since there was only one mug on the desk moments before that, so you think he would have had some awareness of his environment. Now, you might not have noticed this, but this was an entire tutorial. It felt so natural that you might not have even realized the first time you were playing. You're probably wondering what the doctor was thinking when you were playing around with blocks and showing how good you are at jumping. Well, since he really didn't seem that impressed by it. Or maybe you just did notice and I'm just more distracted than other people are, which is very much possible. After getting attacked by the creature, we are knocked out by the gas and wake up back in our room. This time we get to leave our apartment and we only can pick up the wrench, but when we go back to our apartment we could try to break one of these glass things over in the outside of your room, and this is when you physically break free from the simulation you've been kept in. This opening is just genius. Every aspect of our voyage and experiences up to this point has been completely set up. The rooms have these moving walls and monitor windows that create environments to make it seem like it's real to you. Coming back in New Game Plus, you can even see all the signs that it wasn't real. From like scratch marks on the floor, and to how you can't actually throw things outside where the walls would be. Or you really just can't break anything yet. It's not an available thing, which is reasonable. The simulation area is impressive, to say the least. We can walk around and use computers to change the rooms. You get to see how they trick you into believing you were in this traveling across the city, but really you were just in a series of hallways and rooms with observation areas for the researchers. There was real thought and effort put into this design because it is reflective to the larger story. we will get into that later on. If this is your first time playing, you might feel a sense of unease walking around, as you get attacked by creatures that can change into random objects. They won't surprise you with it. The first time you encounter one that can actually hurt you, they'll show you that it can morph. You just need to be paying attention when you enter this room. You'll notice that the ceilings in your room were actually these one-way screens, like the windows were, adding to the creepiness of the whole scenario. These were called looking glass. They are a thin electronic glass, along with the program software that runs it. They do everything a screen does, just in like this realistic hologram way. It's really nice. You'll be seeing these a lot in a number of places around the map. As you make your way out of this area, you're going to go through this decontamination chamber and watch one of the scientists get consumed by one of the creatures. We also learned that these creatures are named mimics, after the infamous Dungeons & Dragons monster with the similar qualities. We're going to be given a glue gun and our first narrow mod. The glue gun is a great tool for both sticking enemies in place or just adventuring the terrain. As far as tutorials go, it does everything it needs to do. It teaches you how to play the game, and there are little things that pop up that you can just X out, so it doesn't matter too much. But it does teach you everything you need to know to get into the game and actually get playing with it. But it also doesn't interfere with the actual gameplay and take you out of the experience to teach you anything. So it's, I would say it's a 10 out of 10 for tutorials. 9 out of 10. 8 out of 10. As I brought up before, the neuromods grant many abilities. The ones that were likely sold to Earth were just the human neuromods. While they don't have nearly many side effects as the Typhon ability mods, they still have the memory loss problem during removal. There's also personality changes that are not entirely understood. This early in the game, your human abilities are all you have access to. Once you get your first mod, you can make the tough choice on which skill you want to use. I picked one of the skills that allow for more access to areas, but this isn't entirely required. You could technically beat the entire game without skills. Some of the neuromods don't make too much sense, but I have some reasoning for them. Now, the way neuromods work in the lore and how they work in-game are different for obvious reasons. In the lore, they kind of, like, each mod does something specific, like granting the ability to play piano at the highest levels or to extend their life. The downside to the neuromods is that you need to get this painfully large needle shot directly through your eye and into the brain, and no thank you. I see why they weren't really marketing the process of modding and just kind of focused on the buffs. Neuromods in the game design work kind of like a lot of other games, but with a skill point. The tougher the skill, the more neuromods you need, obviously. Neuromods affect the brain, so some skills don't make too much sense. Skills that grant more inventory space or chip slots are questionable in nature, but I think I can explain them. While it doesn't work well in the direct action, it can work if we look at it like the knowledge to work more pockets into our suit, kind of like sewing or tailor skill. Now, I don't have too many issues with the skill tree design. It's straightforward and isn't overly designed, but the hacking skill is dumb. Prey does what a lot of games have done, and that is put in a hacking minigame. This might be a bit of a contentious topic, but this is what I think about it. When I put a skill into something, I kind of expect to be able to do what that skill does. The way it's set up now, the skill point only gives us the ability to play the hacking minigame. We need to actually succeed in the hacking minigame to actually hack. And if we fail, we get physically damaged for it. Now, the minigame isn't generally hard, but I use a mouse and keyboard, which makes it a little bit difficult to move in specific paths. Something I found funny about the hacking is that the more levels it is, so let's say it's a 4-level door, and you need all 4 skill points in hacking to open it, those locks are actually easier than the low-level ones due to the extra time that you're given. The repair skill requires repair kits, which makes sense. It costs a resource to fix something. I don't have an issue with that. Leverage skill makes you just have to hold down the button for a second. These really don't take you out of the flow of the game to play a flash game. And while I might not be a huge fan of the way the skill function, it is a very useful skill to put points into. A large portion of the doors and safes can be opened through just hacking, and it makes it one of the best skills to have. In a way, it cheeses the game. I would say that if you want to get the most out of Prey, ignore using this skill for anything that has a passcode somewhere on the map. Places that actually require hacking have the X's over the number panel, so you can't actually input anything. Once you start using this skill, you'll stop trying to find everything and the need for exploration withers, so just avoid it if you want. If you want to get the full experience of Prey, you're not going to want to use hacking on every door. Leverage is probably my favorite skill that provide access. The higher level you are, the heavier objects you can move. Everywhere you go, you'll find these things all over you can throw, including canisters that explode. The heavier the item, the more damage it'll do. But if you're really strong, you can throw lighter items further. Given the fact that resources can be limited if you don't manage well, this can be a good damage choice that won't cost you anything. The repair skill is lower on the list of usefulness, since it only gives you the ability to repair things like turrets and gravity lifts. Once certain things are repaired, you won't really have to repair them again. Other times it won't matter if you repaired, because once a certain type of enemy walks around, they'll just repeatedly damage it. Turrets don't do a huge amount of damage, but sometimes you can position them really well, and you can move them around and deploy them where you need. Just don't become too reliant on them, because as soon as you get a Typhon ability, they'll start to target you. There are options in the difficulty modifiers that can make it so you have to repair your weapons, and this skill can help there, but if you're not playing with it, then the skill is just kind of mediocre, if anything. In the time period the game is set in, they had about 8,000 neuromods. Most of these were probably being used for members of the TranStar staff, test subjects, the board, and their friends. We'll talk about the TranStar later, but the cost of these neuromods were high. There was an email where a mistake with an experiment cost $30 million of material to be wasted when they installed the incorrect neuromods for an experiment. Once Alex figures out how to work with the Typhon, they can really ramp up production though. The most messed up part about any of this stuff is how TranStar used it against the employees. See, one of the benefits of working at TranStar is that promotions come with a neuromod bonus, but at a price. See, they'll give you the neuromods, but if TranStar runs into problems, they can be revoked. And this includes termination, disciplinary action, emergencies, and so on. So let's say you find out something you aren't supposed to know. They can just remove one of the neuromods they gave you, stripping you of all your experiences since you getting that neuromod. They could take things like memory of your child's birth, relationships, personal development and skills, or the death of a family member. To me, this is just too much power for a company to have. I mean, this is to be expected when you give capitalism free rein. And the worst part is, most of these people may never even know what ever happened. It should be obvious by this point, but the whole intro took place on Talos. Exploring the station, there are a lot of places to find that might not be super obvious at first, but with some help, you can be guided to discover these places. Well, you were told how weapons and skills work when you're faced with them. You might not really know how it can help you. The developer sought to remedy this by small encounters that will show you how something works through an experience. These are optional, and you can enter these rooms before viewing the scene. The obvious ones you can come across is this observation room where you have to watch a man fight a phantom, and you really can't interact with it because of a projector or something. He uses a glue gun to make a path to a vent that would allow him to hide in a small room. This usually kills the man, but it helps stimulate the player's imagination, hopefully giving them ideas of how to traverse better. This isn't the only time the game tries to help you with tips, but the way they did this one felt right. It might not be super obvious to some gamers, and it might be to others, but it can help. You should probably be picking up all the junk you could find. This stuff can be brought to one of those recyclers, which can be converted into raw material cubes. And they will make a variety of items, like from ammo to actual neuromods, and yes, you can actually craft the skill points in the game. Crafting the game is immersive, but very slow. You can only do one item at a time, which becomes very tedious. Neuromod development is limited at first, but you can complete a mission to unlock them in the crafted machine again, but for good this time. And there's a fun little mission about this. As soon as the guy who developed it found out how the neuromods were made, he's like, yeah, I don't like this. Your inventory is limited, but as I said before, you can unlock more space by installing pockets in your brain. Recyclers are all over Talos 1, so you just dump your junk regularly. Just be careful not to waste all your resources on ammo for your guns. I did this my first playthrough, and I had a hard time dealing with the harder stages of the game. They did this purposely to punish you for shooting everything. You can run around collecting all the material, but since you're constantly revisiting areas you've already looted, you'll run out of stuff to find eventually. If you aren't managing your resources, you'll screw yourself. Like any good immersive sim, you're given all the options to get places. You just need to be creative in your approach. I'll use this ledge early in the game as an example of approach. The first one I thought of was just jumping on this ledge and walking over, which is probably the easiest way actually. But you can also just make a path with your glue gun, or you can find the key card to open a door. There are certainly more methods, but you're just really going to solve the problem as you see fit. Later on in the game, you can just jump this ledge with a boosted character, but I mean, you're not going to do that this early. Some rooms are completely troll by design. These might appear to have a few paths in, or even one, like a ceiling hatch or a broken door that you'll need to shapeshift to get past, but this distracts from a much easier path in, and this is usually just breaking the window and walking in. But because of the way the windows look, it might not really appear as you can just jump into it. I'm sure a few people out there have maneuvered around an obstacle just to discover the window is smashable. Did this a couple times, and there's more than one instance of this. Now let's talk about the space. It is accessible in Prey, and it acts more like a informal fast travel. The airlocks are all locked by default, so you'll need to access the computer at each of them to get them from the outside. You only need to access one airlock to explore the space though, so while it is a bit hard to control, there could be a lot out here. Just keep an eye out for holes in the station and maintenance tunnels because you can find like weapons and your own mods stashed away. This next part's people are going to have to sit tight and keep an open mind because what we're going to be talking about is a little bit controversial. It's a little history. In the same section you start the game in is where the volunteer section is. The volunteers are apparently, according to the game lore, all from the gulags. Gulags were the Soviet prisons that the government used from the 20s to 50s, but most people know what the gulags were, even if their idea about them are exaggerated and ignore the American prison system altogether. TranStar claims to get their volunteers from these places, then claims to send them home with reduced sentences. This is not what is happening, as not all prisoners are from the gulags like sources claim. The point of the volunteer programs is to test neuromods out on human subjects to understand function and see if there are any side effects. Some even have their skills mapped and used in the production of neuromods, of which only TranStar profits. When we enter the testing area of the station where the Typhon research takes place, we find a volunteer named Aaron Ingram that was in the process of being tested on. And by being tested on, I mean he had already served his purpose to TranStar, and now they're feeding him to the Typhon. And this is to create more exotic material to produce more neuromods. So not only do they steal and profit from the actual skills of a person, they can convert their life into material for production of more neuromods. Aaron is interesting though, as he doesn't sound Russian, and when you look up his file in the TranStar records, it's claimed that he's from a Siberian labor camp, but this is of course a lie. If we choose to let him live, he will give us the codes to the armory, if you haven't opened it already, of course. But we'll find out more about him. He's apparently an American political prisoner who stepped on someone's toes, and this landed him on the experimental list of a megacorporation. This leads me to believe that there could actually be a number of volunteers that aren't actually from the gulags, but of course the gulags are just an scapegoat. The USSR being used this way is neither new nor surprising. The fact that the USSR still exists in this timeline is rather interesting and require a lot of information to understand how exactly that happened, but the information we get in the game is not going to do that. Most of the changes seem to have happened to the mid to late 60s when the Typhon were encountered. The interpretation of the Soviet Union in this game reminds me of the American interpretation of the Stalin era. It's also important to take into consideration that there were changes made during the Kennedy era. Kennedy, surviving the assassination attempt against him, had chosen not to involve himself in the Vietnam War, and I found that out by the writing of an alternative history book. I suspect that means that they won't involve themselves in communist affairs, and this would be great for all these socialist nations around the world that the Soviets spent billions on to protect every year. They could actually develop their economies without any of that neoliberal influence and sanctions that would only serve to hurt them. And this would also mean that there'd be less paramilitary groups paid for by the CIA to disrupt power, infiltrate government, and of course to create the classic anti-government movements that they love so much. In this timeline, and the little resources we get about the Soviets, it's really not, that's not what's happening. Not in a way, at least. In a way, it seems like the few pages of work we actually get are intentionally bad as to demonize and dehumanize the Soviets. It's kind of like it was made to make experimentation on them slightly easier to the psyche. I should probably move on now and ignore this perspective of history, but it's my video. This history reminds me of what I learned about the Soviets growing up in the USA. While the history isn't exactly wrong, due to it being from the perspective of the opposition, things are heavily twisted, exaggerated, and nuance is ignored. The game says that the Soviets suffered economic collapse due to overreaching with their space program, but that doesn't make much sense. The USSR had one of the fastest growing economies ever. While Khrushchev's economic policies would lead to stagnation in the country, less US involvement would mean that they wouldn't have been sanctioned, or at least to a much lesser degree. They have a planned economy, and their space program only cost about 1 to 1.5% of their GNP in the 70s and 80s. And this is a fair amount more than the USA was spending at the time, but it satisfied their needs. Even if you multiplied this, they wouldn't have destroyed themselves. The writing in the game is essentially saying the Soviet economy was inefficient, where space ventures can collapse their economy. Even with sanctions, space ventures, and the cost of defending their communist allies from Western intervention, they didn't face economic collapse. Even with stagnation and Cold War tensions did their economy collapse. This just comes from the idea that planned economies don't work, but that's something that Americans need to believe. Their system of 100 companies pretending to compete with each other to keep prices high will collapse again, but as long as people believe this is the only option, they won't want change. Of course, the Soviet economy saw it collapse and the breakup of the Union in our timeline, But it was more complicated than just planned economies fail. It was a growing second economy that was infecting their first economy, brought on by Khrushchev's economic reforms that allowed things like private land ownership. As the country stepped away from Stalin-era politics more and more, they would make more and more concessions to the second economy, and then Gorbachev came around and made a whole bunch of stupid choices that screwed up the Soviet economy really badly. This made room for Yeltsin, who introduced shock therapy and caused economic collapse. No doubt the USA influenced politics, but it was a step away from centralization that would lead to their collapse. Really, none of this matters to Prey. The aggressive imperialist power that wants to annex and spread communism to all corners of the world is the narrative here. Prey's interpretation of Lenin's vision of communist Russia still being alive and well is questionable, to say the least. I can't say what Lenin's exact vision of communism was going to look like. Most of what I've read of his theories were on achieving communism. He knew what would be required to ensure that the still feeble communist system didn't get killed by the defeated capitalists. While they were defeated, they weren't stomped out. They were a branch of international capital and influences that would only increase their bitterness towards the newly formed socialist nation. They had vast social connections that could be used to hurt the nation and the workers' democracy. Khrushchev's reforms went against Lenin's economic theories, and that can't be ignored, like the allowances of private property and weakening of the proletarian dictatorship. The term dictatorship might be scary, but here it just means the working class is in control, a requirement to ensure that the more powerful capitalist doesn't exploit the system. Western history has twisted this to make it seem like it repressed freedom of its people and killed innocents, but that interpretation has always been silly. It says that by capitalists losing power and control over commodity production, it is restricting freedom. A freedom only obtained by the bourgeois class built off the surplus value of labor and price exploitation of the consumer. The Western version of history needs to be the dominant narrative. It makes the working class feel like they are one opportunity away from having everything the rich have. That if you just work hard enough, you'll get there eventually. A belief more unrealistic than the utopian socialism of the past. It is a belief system that only requires infinite growth, but infinite labor to exploit. There's a group called the Mensheviks in one of the books, and this book brings up a few things I don't want to really get into, but the Mensheviks was interesting. They're one of the main political parties during the Russian Socialist Revolution. Being a social democratic labor party, they would have actually been okay with the market reforms that Gorbachev was doing in the 80s. The problem with the Mensheviks here is the fact that they were dissolved in 1921, more than 100 years before the events of the game. It just feels like they're trying to make exceptions to the social democratic ideology while condemning other left-leaning beliefs due to the Red Scare propaganda we see commonly in North America. Now, one of the most common myths in the USA is the Soviets didn't have democracy, but this is massively incorrect. They didn't have democracy that favors capitalists or alternative systems, but one that favors the working class within a communist system. Stalin didn't have the control of the nation like we were told. He was turned down a number of times by the Soviet parliament for a number of different things, and it wasn't annexations, but defensive unions. And if people are going to say something about the one candidate ballot thing, then that's true, but it wasn't really that straightforward. This narrative lacks nuance on how a candidate was selected, but this is intentional. It's another step on making sure the working class think capitalism is the only option. The way candidates were selected was work collectives would get together and present candidates that they would argue for and against. People would speak frankly about these candidates, and by the time an official vote was cast, they would have already had a majority support of the people. They would just need to then vote to either accept or reject the candidate. There's a person named Pat Salone who was a British teacher that worked within the Soviet Union in the 30s. He was able to participate within a Soviet election because he worked within it, giving him that right. I left a link to his book along with a number of other sources and reading material if you want to learn more. The version of history we get in the game comes from the Western narratives of the Stalin era, written by the opposition to assure that the ideas of socialism don't gain traction. Even the language used is meant to drive a certain feeling towards the nation and its ideology. Instead of foreign intervention, they would have ensured the people retain a negative opinion of their foreign power and communism. All nuance of action and intent stripped away to create a short, consumable story. It is genius for the story of Prey. Not only were the volunteers supposed to be death row inmates, they are from the gulags. It makes it so easy to demonize and dehumanize them as people for experimentation. It's important to take into consideration that the view of prisons in the United States, where prisons can and are used for cheap labor, they're essentially slaves. I just find it funny that the only prisoner you can actually save in the entire game is an American prisoner. The only person that you can prove to be American is the only guy you can save. Alright, now that a bunch of people have stopped watching, many of which have left me downvoted a nasty comment about my knowledge of the Soviet history, we can move on to the stealth part. Don't worry, this section will be short. Prey stealth is actually pretty good. One of the more interesting places on Talos is the research area where the Typhon are kept. I've already mentioned this place before, but it is the backbone of the station. This area requires a psychoscope to enter due to the telepath's abilities. I'll talk about the Typhons in their own section, so we'll move on. The psychoscope is a helmet-like device that was created by a team of people which Morgan claimed credit for. This is a common practice within, our society. It's designed to scan the Typhon and protect the user from their mind control abilities. Trevor Young, the guy in the trauma center who's mind controlled, could have likely been the reason for the Typhon to escape. You'll need to scan each type of Typhon multiple times, thus unlocking their abilities. It also seconds as a flashlight if you find yourself without a battery for whatever reason. Not sure why though. Dark rooms are few and far between, so it's not really likely to happen. The chamber seems to be Soviet built, functioning several decades after its construction, so that's interesting. It still has the Soviet writing on it. My favorite room in this research area is the lab that was researching the Typhon morph ability. In one of the side rooms, you can manipulate the items in which the mimic will change into and watch it. I've switched out a bunch of items, and I really haven't found anything they won't change into. As long as it roughly isn't too big, they'll morph into it. The doctor research in this skill had a fun lab, which is why I love it so much. All the items in the room have sticky notes on them with "not a mimic" written. Most of the people have felt this to some extent the first time playing, but by now most players are probably comfortable with the station. But we still kind of get this anxiety. It's kind of the same anxiety we get entering the first room full of mimics. You just want to hit everything with a wrench. But it's great environmental storytelling. Other tests in this area include the luring of the Typhon and the coral. Coral is this yellow streak and mist stuff. It won't hurt you or cause any side effects when you walk through it, but if you have a certain set of chipsets, it'll restore your psychic mana stuff as you stand in it. But that's pretty much it. There isn't much around when you first discover it, but there will be as the game continues. A type of Typhon called the Weaver creates it. To the Typhon, the coral is this neural network. We even have these neural nodes similar to like a neuron. The purpose of this isn't exactly defined, but it essentially contains information for the other Typhon. I will elaborate this a little bit more later on. As you make choices around the station, you might notice that the developers have accounted for them. This includes making the choice to kill an NPC before you hear what they have to say. I appreciate this type of game design because it really feels like I'm making my own path, even if it is still within the confines of the design. I wish we had this in other games that claim to be immersive sims, but we get it here. As soon as you see a character in person, you are given the ability to kill them. Humans are few and far between, so when you encounter one, it's supposed to be a big deal. I believe there are 42 you can encounter, including those being mind-controlled by the telepaths. So if you want the achievement for killing all the humans, you need to kill all 42 of them. I can't really think of many places that are inaccessible. They did a really good job of filling each of the areas up with as much stuff as possible. A lot of the rooms just need to meet certain conditions to enter them, even if they aren't always obvious at first. Unlike most games, it doesn't really feel like a chore to spend a lot of times in each of the rooms. Loot isn't exactly random unless it's on a corpse. Dead people can have different items depending on the playthrough. Even the pipes have all kinds of hidden treasures around. Maybe treasures wasn't the right word, actually. I'm bad for not looking up, even finding things I should have noticed earlier. One of the places I didn't notice at first was the Neuromod section. There's this maintenance tunnel that leads to the top area, but if you don't have the recycler, leverage, or any other skill that helps move things, you won't be able to really access it. It even seemed like a great area to hide if something goes wrong. Oh, well, not for this guy apparently. It does help to be observant, as the neuromods and other loot can be stashed pretty much anywhere. Neuromods are really useful tools for your playthrough, so if you find them, they're just gonna help speed things along, or just make things a bit easier. When exploring, we have access to the station map that shows where each of the sections meet up with one another. If you want maps of each of the areas, you need to download them from the security stations. There's one in each of the sections, but they can be tough to enter sometimes. These security stations can help you find specific people as long as they still have their tracking bracelets. And this isn't useful for most of the game, and the maps aren't super important, just as long as you can navigate the station through quest markers, so you don't have much of an issue. I do like having them for finding recyclers though, since you need to use those regularly. Once you get to the Abrium, you can defeat a technopath and unlock the elevator, and this will take you to one of the 3 main hub areas. These are the lobby, life support, and the Abrium. While it isn't bringing you to a specific location, these places kind of have a bunch of branches that lead off to other areas, so it is a quick travel method for long distance exploration. The guts area is terrible, and I am not a fan of exploring it due to the zero gravity. I never really got used to it using it on a mouse and keyboard. And it goes along the length of the station and has a few side paths along it, and it's a pretty quick way to go if you want to get from one side of the station to the other, but there are a lot of Typhon catalysts in it, and they tend to be pretty annoying. It might be an easier way to travel if you're trying to just get from one end to the other, but fuck it. The nice thing about the way this map is designed is there are just multiple paths for most of the locations. Something I believe to be important to Prey's plot is Fermi's paradox. Fermi's paradox is the fact that the Milky Way has hundreds of billions of stars with billions similar to our own. It is likely that a portion have planets similar to Earth where intelligent life could eventually develop advanced technology. Many of these stars are billions of years older than our own, with plenty of time for space travel to have occurred. Given all this, why does it feel like we're alone in the galaxy? I personally believe life is out there somewhere. I just don't believe they're coming and chatting with your crazy Confederate uncle. If they're chatting with anyone, they'll be chatting with government and academia. The presence of the Fermi's paradox text is likely the developer's way of saying the Typhon are a very old species that have been the cause of the science in the universe. The main antagonists we've been talking about are these amorphous creatures that multiply through mitosis after consuming their victim. One human will produce 3 mimics. Sometimes an elite mimic is created that we call a greater mimic. In the Soviets' encounter footage, we get to witness the first time this happens. Not the greater mimic, the regular mimic. It isn't exactly know why it happens, but at some point, a mimic is selected and killed, in which it transforms into a weaver. Weavers will create most of the other enemies we see around. They use corpses to create phantoms, which sometimes fail or mutate and become poltergeists. They also convert mimics into telepaths, which will control the minds of humans. There are also technopaths that control electrical equipment, but it's unclear how they form. I've seen phantoms destroying electrical equipment before, so I wonder if they're trying to adapt the tech, or they're just trying to destroy things. It's really not clear which. There's one mob called a nightmare. The existence of this mob verifies to some extent that the Typhon are conscious creatures that can think and plan, because it was created just to stop Morgan. They know Morgan's trying to stop them, and realize they need to do more about it. Mimics are the weakest, but important to their eusocial system. They alone have the ability to change into objects, but how they do this isn't exactly clear. There are a bunch of theories on how this happens, but it's a video game. Regardless of the theory, there's always going to be some level of impossibility. Mimics are also the beginning of their colonization cycle that the Typhon go through. They've adapted to a number of species over maybe billions of years. Alex Yu talks about how they lack mirror neurons, so they learn skills directly from the source of knowledge. I would guess this was an evolutionary choice, one that Alex Yu thinks that needs to be changed, probably so we can manipulate their empathy. To the Typhon, why spend time trying to learn a skill when you can just adapt it directly? This is also the ability that was manipulated to create the neuromod. Out of all the Typhon we encounter in the game, the catalysts are by far the most annoying. Cystoids or something like that. They aren't exactly enemies, which is why I didn't mention them before. The cystoids are essentially homing radiation explosives. If they're in zero gravity, they'll float towards you, and if you are in gravity, they'll just roll towards you. The best strategy is to throw something at them. Explosive canisters probably being the best option. Just don't ignore them, because you will have problems if you try to do that. The Typhon aren't the most unique enemy design, as the mimics kind of look like the headcrabs from Half-Life, but function like mimics in D&D. This is alright to me though. Most of the other Typhon are interesting enough and fit the general theme. You aren't going to look at a Typhon and wonder if it actually belongs to Typhon species. They'll have the extremely dark, cloudy bodies with tentacle-like limbs. This composition flows throughout the Typhon design from the mimics to the Apex, and the Apex is a mob I've been avoiding talking about for a while due to it being pretty much endgame. You actually can't kill it, so the only way to get rid of it is to complete the game, so we'll talk about it later on. And the last thing to mention about the Typhon, without going into the Moon Crash DLC, is the elemental varieties. These are pretty much common video game tropes that add some variety and complexity to the individual creatures. In Prey, we get electric, fire, and ether. It's really pretty normal stuff we see. The phantom variety of these can be very strong, so be careful. I guess let's talk about weapons, but I don't want to go into too much detail for each of them, since this video is going to be extremely long already. The glue gun I've already talked about a few times. It could be used to scale environments to reach places and can be used to freeze enemies. This works well as a combo to hold enemies still for a melee attack. It also works to seal pipes and things that are spewing fire. It's a rather innovative weapon. I just don't like the fact that you can't glue down opponents. It's pretty frustrating. It's probably the most annoying thing in the entire game. The wrench is the melee weapon, and it bashes things. There is a cooler weapon in Moon Crash that works as a melee, but we don't get it in this one. We just get the wrench. We also get a silenced pistol and a shotgun, which really need no explanation. There's a golden gun in the game. Shout out to 007 GoldenEye. It doesn't do any more damage than a normal one, but it's gold, so it's cool. It can be found in the crew quarters inside of one of the safes. The disruptor gun shoots thunderbolts that also stun certain enemies, or can knock out humans if they're being mind controlled. It can also disrupt electrical equipment and damage enemies like the Technopath and the other operating machines. And then you have the Q-beam, which is this experimental weapon developed by one of the scientists in TranStar. It doesn't really do damage, but instead will cause the life bar on the enemy to turn green, and when the bar fills up, they will die. This weapon was designed by a guy who went on to use it against the person who took credit for it. Fun stuff. And then you have this toy crossbow that shoots these foam darts. This is purely used to hit buttons on doors or computers that are out of reach. This is also fun to mess with the Typhons with it, since it doesn't hurt them. It's just a foam dart after all. There are also 4 grenades in the game, but not conventional grenades. Of these 4, my favorite is the recycler, which will suck matter in and turn it into raw material. This works for both organic and inorganic materials, and I highly suggest you don't get caught in it, or else you'll likely die. The next one is the Typhon lure, which just shines a bright light that the Typhon love. They swarm to it like moths to a streetlight. The EMP disables machines for a few seconds. This works for a couple different machines. And the last one is a null wave transmitter that disables psionic abilities. So pretty much just the psychic Typhons. It's not that useful in my playthroughs. You can scan the Typhons to find out what they're weak against, to find out what you want to use. I don't use the EMP null wave Typhon lure as much as I should, but I'm willing to bet they'll come into use in the harder difficulties. I'm just playing on the normal and hard difficulties for most of my playthroughs right now. Grenades can also be placed on things to set traps. This makes it easier to kind of hit quick moving targets when they come at you. Things can be tough for some people, so once you understand your enemies, you're able to kind of best come up with strategies to better deal with them. Just really don't get too close to your grenades, especially recycler. It will kill you. I can't express that enough. I've been trying to use they them pronouns for the protagonists. I played the game more as a male than a female, but it's still important to include both of them in the conversation. Let's move on to TranStar now. Our protagonist agreed to be part of the simulation, as you already know. At the beginning of the experiment, they would update Morgan after Neuromod removal. As the test went on, the people in charge stopped updating them, forcing them to relive the same day over and over again. This went on for a while. We were told the year was 2032 at the start of the simulation, but we find out the year is 2035 after escaping it. Alex Yu, Morgan's brother, was aware of this, but he had his reasons to keep Morgan ignorant. Morgan was becoming unstable due to the installation and removal of the new neuromods. Their personality was changing, becoming prone to outbursts. This was an unforeseen side effect, but they decided to move forward with the test anyways. At some point, Morgan escaped and reprogrammed a couple bots. This would be December and January. We find out that one of our past selves had a plan to destroy Talos in order to stop the Typhon. This came from a Looking Glass video we left ourselves. Halfway through this, Alex cuts the video and it forces us to go to Calvino's lab to fix it. While there, you can grab the doctor's thermos from underneath one of the stairs and put it on the hot plate thing, and it will open a secret compartment. If you found this on your own, cool, but if not, here you go. You'll get a couple neuromods in the key card to the doctor's office. This is at the beginning of the game, so you can always return to grab it. Alex doesn't want us to destroy the Typhon, so he hides this information. The puzzle pieces that are the business practices of TranStar can be found across the station in various emails and audio logs. One of the many malicious practices that come from TranStar is their bonus program. See, TranStar awards employees for performing well on the job and grants neuromods as bonuses. The problem with this is bonuses can be revoked for a number of reasons, and this includes termination, disciplinary action, and emergencies. Emergencies include working close to the Typhon. There are emails you can find related to how whole departments have their memories set to be wiped. This is between Alex Yu and one of the psychotronics director, Hans Kalstrop. Alex wants Stephen Muller's team to have their memories wiped, and it isn't really clear who's part of his team, but he's in theoretical physics and working close with the Typhon, so it's likely to just remove the memories of most of the staff regularly, regardless of any setbacks of progress. Hans is one of the ones who has to send them for removal, but questions the practice. This gives me a hint that this is a normal thing on Talos. And this isn't the only clue we get that they use this against their employees. Medical records show that staff need to be cycled out every few months due to behavioral issues, the same issues that come from repeated neuromod removal. I'm just not willing to push aside the possibility that TranStar regularly removes neuromods from staff in the off chance they know about the Typhon and how exotic material is created. Most material have their costs, but exotic material is a bit more difficult to create. It requires the material extraction from the Typhon, and this requires mimics to go through mitosis after they consume a human. Yes, TranStar is using humans to feed the Typhon for their research and financial benefit. Woot woot. Just kidding. The breakdown is pretty straightforward. It is 3.25 exotic material per mimic and 9.75 from the 3 mimics that split after consuming a human. We know this from the Aaron Ingram experiment, which gives us 13 exotic material. To create a neuromod, it costs 3 exotic material. This means 1 human life can create 3 neuromods. They're going to need to keep feeding them just to keep their populations up, and in the crew section we hear a recording from Alex giving a speech that he proudly gloats about creating their 8,000th neuromod.
We have broken the 8,000 neuromod line.
This means that more than 2,460 people have been killed for the creation of neuromods, and without the repopulation numbers, of course, all to give rich people a greater advantage than they already have. And then we have the sacrifices required to keep up with their research, and this is probably another 700 people. These numbers are probably underestimating, but you aren't going to find them within the TranStar records. It's just important to remember that the people in the volunteer program never leave. They're just all fed to the Typhon. All the other volunteers just believe they're sent home. There's even a morgue to dispose of their corpses. Regardless of how many people have been killed for this purpose, a matter of fact is the Yu family are okay with it. To them, the ends justify the means. The humans that benefit can ask the morality question later.
What else are we going to do? Blow everything up? That won't save us.
And if it does work, is it worth it?
The people that come after us will be smarter, stronger, immortal. They can judge us if they want. But they'll know they exist because of the things we did. I'm ready.
It might be obvious in which stance I'd take, but exploiting prisoners for the benefit of rich people is, bad. Alex and Morgan don't see it the way I do. They think that they're taking the utilitarian route, that one day man will be immortal thanks to this research, and that alone is worth the sacrifices made. After all, they're just Soviet prisoners from the gulags. What does it matter? There doesn't seem to be any regulatory agencies for space, so TranStar can pretty much do whatever they want. They just need to keep their actions secret or risk hurting neuromod sales and backlash. Of course, people would love neuromods, but very few are going to push for the knowledge on how they're made exactly. Alex Yu is the CEO and president of TranStar, with the whole Yu family being leading members of the TranStar staff or board. Yet this really isn't enough to protect Morgan and Alex from their failures. Their own father found out about the problems aboard Talos and sent a cleanup crew, a man named Dahl, and his fleet of black box operators to help with his goals. These are military-grade operator droids, and when I say a fleet, I really mean it. Once they're on the station, they are pretty much everywhere. Upon their arrival, they claim that they're here to rescue the staff and that Morgan and Alex are relieved of their position. The rescue staff part isn't true. If we go aboard the ship Dahl arrived in, we can hear the mission brief from William Yu, their father. He orders Dahl to dispose of the crew and collect data. And you can deal with him in a number of different ways. It's just important to remember that William Yu is willing to kill his own children. Even filicide isn't off the table for these cutthroats. Now let's talk about the effect neuromods have on society and how Morgan, Alex, and TranStar board were pretty much cool with all of it. They are pretty much willing to force humans through a type of social Darwinism. Not only will the cost of these neuromods prevent many from being able to purchase them, tests found that some were unable to even get modded. There's a type of neurological degenerative disease that prevents the installation of people affected. It was given the name paraplexis or white noise. People will never be able to utilize a neuromod, and as such will never be able to keep up in a post-neuromod capitalist society. People can spend their life learning something, but those with the money can just buy the skill, given a lifetime experience and knowledge in a single uncomfortable eye poke. superhumans would dominate the unmodded, probably leading to the future evolution of human. Due to the demand, the only people who would be able to have access to him would be the highest bidder. This wouldn't really benefit humanity, but just the bourgeoisie. They'll be looking to stack and gain as many abilities as possible, and due to the production requirements, Alex and Morgan must have realized for a large amount of humans to benefit from them, they would have needed to create some kind of like death camp. One human only creates 3 mods, but there are potentially hundreds of skills one can get in the lore of the game, like playing piano to having a longer life. For us in the game, we need 218 neuromods to max out just the human skill tree alone. That would need dozens of people to have to die just for one person to get stronger, smarter, and to live over 100. And this does also mean that it is likely that Kennedy had his life extended because he lived to be 114. Unfortunately, most of these ramblings aren't how the world turned out. Yes, unfortunately, I am just making speculation about how neuromods would affect a liberal society. The reality is much worse. The human skills weren't the only ones TranStar was hoping to exploit. They want to claim the Typhon skills for themselves. This came with extra risks they needed to work out. At first, I thought Alex was worried about the Typhon ability neuromods, but this wasn't exactly what was happening. In the video, Alex and Morgan are talking about the Typhon abilities. Alex was worried about how the tests were affecting Morgan. Morgan, you convinced him that they were still Morgan and not to worry about it. And this is even though Alex knew Morgan was suffering from personality changes. What I don't understand exactly is how he appears to care for Morgan, yet puts them in the front line of risk. Otherwise, his motives are clear and his tone is soft. Alex seems to care about his family, but also the research. His narcissism takes over his nepotism after his father pretty much sends a kill squad. And another thing they did was they also rigged all the escape pods to be useless other than Alex's. Only a few members of the staff were even aware of this, and the rest of them had to figure out the hard way. But Alex's parents were willing to kill their children, so I think that's the highlight of it. With the use of the Psychoscope, you're able to learn about the Typhon. With each scan, you will unlock an ability or just information in some cases. When you scan your copy, you can find out how much Morgan loves themselves. This is obviously supposed to be humorous, and I do love it. The main purpose of the simulation and the test Morgan went through was to test the Typhon abilities. I was hesitant to use these skills at first, because I got so comfortable using the human skills. Once I started using the Typhon powers, a lot of the gameplay changed, and instead of me scanning a room for mimics with a sensor or just hitting random things to test them, I would just blast whatever I suspected to be a mimic. Even if I missed it, there's a large enough area of effect that I could hit a mimic that was just kind of sitting nearby. These neuromods are leagues above the human skills. Not to say some of the human skills aren't useful, but the Typhon skills are much more effective. The Typhon have their own set of skills that allow you to pass through a variety of paths. One of the more obvious ones being the morph. You can change yourself into small objects and pass through broken doors. Or if you just want to be stealthy. I haven't done that one yet though. There's one that works like an anti-gravity lift that helps you reach higher areas like you would normally use the glue gun for. Then there's one for remote manipulation. This one allows you to manipulate computers and buttons from afar, or if you just want to grab something from far away. The Typhons give you a vast set of skills that are just as versatile as the human skills, if not more in some cases. The biggest thing is you just can't hack or repair things. That's pretty much it. The damage abilities are where it's at for me though. With the fire, electric, ether, and explosive skill, not even a nightmare is a problem. These creatures are so dangerous that it has a time limit, so you don't have to really worry about it hanging around an area for the entire time. They're only really around for a few minutes, so you can just wait them out. Not me though, I always kill these guys. Now let's talk about why these abilities would be terrible for society. Besides the obvious problems of having a class of elites that can control minds, there are other problems. Imagine living in a society where someone can just, protect themselves with a force field and then set proximity firebombs. And then when someone dies from them, they can just create phantoms from their corpses. The effects of this would ripple through society as these people claim power, but let's be real though, this would have been the TranStar staff of directors. After their attempts to kill Alex and Morgan, it was pretty much just Alex and whoever he wants. And if someone disagrees, they can just get their mind controlled. Easy enough. Well, most of this is not true, as it isn't really known how neuromods really affected society exactly, but we get an idea of how the Typhon do. These neuromods came with a few more side effects. Whether it's a human or a Typhon ability, there's a chance people are going to see things in their dreams, kind of like seeing an Apex or a Phantom. The Typhon abilities also add a bit of the Typhon material, changing them. This will cause scanners to perceive a person as a Typhon and shoot them if it's a turret. It's also not wise to use these skills in front of humans. They will instantly go hostile towards you. Then we have the likelihood of Typhon material being within a person means that they can actually consume their host, but this thing is only something I'm not too confident about. I'm really only basing this idea and theory off.
Final topic. Your mind is free of significant Typhon neuromods. I believe the risk you pose to Earth is minimal. However, despite my belief, I cannot act against my directives.
A small cutscene where you see like tentacles coming out of an arm, but this is just likely related to the post-credit scene. After you've dealt with Transtar's cleanup crew, however you saw fit, we can finally meet up with Alex and get his army key. You need both Alex and Morgan's army key to activate the self-destruct, but Alex is being a bitch about giving his. Alex tells us how inspiring Morgan was, proving how anything was possible, no matter the cost. Now this is immediately interrupted by the opening of a rift and a large Typhon called the Apex coming through, but it's a very distracting moment and distracting enough for people to move on to the bigger problems, but I'm not like that. Alex was cool with the fact that so many people have been killed for these neuromods, and the Typhon escaping and killing the station, yeah, that's just a setback. Alex tries to convince Morgan not to blow up the station and instead use a null wave device to just kill the Typhon. This is one of the choices you have to end the game, and I would say it's a bit easier than the other endings, but nonetheless relevant. Before moving on, I just want to appreciate the fact that you can kill Alex here and the game accounts for it. Their parents suck, but damn, this whole family is screwed up for thinking sacrificing inmates is just a...
Even if the price was steep.
Nothing about this short conversation with Alex tells me he's done researching the Typhon, and even though both the station and Moonbase have failed, he just wants it all. If you don't kill him, he just gets knocked unconscious after the Apex comes through the portal, and then we go out and make our final choices. Now, let's say you go and build the null wave device. It'll just wipe the Typhon off and the credits start to roll. If you decide to use the army keys, you'll need to go down to the reactor. After you start the countdown, you'll have a few choices to make. Now, I don't want to go through all of the endings, but I have a few that I want to talk about. One of them is related to the doll ship. If Igwe, one of the main scientists on Talos, removes Doll's neuromods, he can pilot the ship out with the survivors so you aren't caught in the explosion. I'm also a fan of heading down to the captain's chair and just watch in the best seat of the house. That's my go-to. It's nice that they gave you the options to not kill Dull and use him to escape the station before exploding it. It isn't much, but creating games is a costly and difficult process. There are only so many options you can put in a game before you're taking up too much work. Choices do have to be limited, but they spent their time really well. Most of the paths lead the same way, but it doesn't mean your choices aren't being accounted for. The Apex is an inconvenience for the most part, and it isn't around very long, and there isn't anything to learn from it. Scanning its tentacles won't show anything or tell you anything. The Apex is essentially the end goal of the mimics. Now, I don't believe the Apexes are clean or anything. It's just likely a very large Typhon that can be sent out to help colonize worlds. They could help also have the ability to send out mimics and continue the cycle, but I'm really not too sure about that one. It's an inconvenience. It's not really super important. It's been hinted at, and that's it. Upon blowing up the station or destroying the Typhon, we get a cutscene of the crew quarters being taken over by the Typhon. A cool little cutscene, but not the actual end of the game. There's still a post-credit interaction we have to go through. We wake up in a room that is obviously still in space with Alex and a few droids. They contain the consciousness of Igwe, Sho, Ilushin, and Alazar. I did not say those names correctly, I don't think. It turns out that all our experiences were part of a simulation. Alex implanted the memories of Morgan into a Typhon and put it into a simulation in the hopes that it'll learn empathy. And then when the simulation is done, they will judge the Typhon based on how it helped or didn't. Before you are judged, you are shown the world. It is Earth, but the Typhon coral is spread far, and it is Alex's hopes that the Typhon will learn human empathy to bridge the two species. Whatever choices you make on Talos Station, it doesn't stop the Typhon from spreading to Earth, and it wouldn't have, since the Typhon neuromods aren't limited to this station. For either of the choices to have mattered, they would have needed to secure the neuromods in the off chance the Typhon neuromods change the person into a Typhon. After you are done being judged, assuming you made all the morally correct choices, you are given a final choice, but this time, your choice is to either help Alex with his goals or to kill everyone in the room and rejoin the Typhon. Now, a normal person might, help Alex, but I don't support this choice. Alex was the president and CEO of TranStar, and he had control of the entire neuromod development. He could have pulled the plug at any point, but the risks, they didn't matter. but he supported sacrificing people to conduct research. Just like how the board was okay with sending a cleanup crew to kill the staff of Talos, Alex was willing to let people die if it meant the potential advancements of neuromods live on. This is why he didn't immediately seek to have the Typhon destroyed once they ran wild. He thought he had the power to get them under control and continue his research, but they had gotten too bad and the no-wave plan had to be put in action. The board of directors for TranStar aren't openly known, but they're supposed to be people in leadership roles of government and business. These people didn't stop the research either, since they sent a cleanup crew to secure the research and eliminate all the staff. No matter what Alex intends to do if he's able to stop the Typhon, it will include the continual death of prisoners. It is funny to think that the Typhon would even accept any truce just because one of their colony picked up and started to empathize with their food source. They lack mirror neurons, but if these were so important, they would have developed them. I think Alex just wants to use this Typhon as a form of queen and use it to manipulate the colony around Earth, but that is left to be seen for any future sequel, and I really do believe that's what they're trying to do. It was a little bizarre that Alex wants to install Morgan's memories into a Typhon to try to teach it empathy when neither one of them cared enough leading up to the game to even prove they knew what it was. They killed thousands of people to make their neuromods. Alex gave himself the only functioning escape pod while the crew had to find out the hard way that the others don't work. We're sitting here trying to teach a fucking Typhon empathy. It's fucking ridiculous. If the Typhon were an intelligent species, which they are, then they have no reason to accept a deal with Alex. The Typhon are aware of what Alex has done to them and their own people, but leave it to a capitalist to think he could fix the problems they created. Of course, the solution to the problem will always include the continuation of what caused the problem. The Typhon escaped and killed a bunch of people, so they sent a cleanup crew and to start the research over again, for only to escape again. Instead of dealing with the problem, they want to capitalize on a solution. Instead of destroying the invading Typhon, they want to manipulate them. Really, they're just trying to make the Typhon team players for the betterment of Alex and the few who can afford it. I might have rambled on about this, but given the choice between helping an arrogant fool or just allowing humanity to die, humanity is just better off dying. I believe it's important to remember that this choice is from the perspective of a Typhon, not an actual human. The Typhon are a eusocial species, so they're not going to accept a Typhon that isn't part of their collective. Like a bee from another hive, they're just going to see this neurodivergent Typhon as an invader. I do think, though, that the actual ending and final judgment's a really cool choice. It doesn't leave it as just like a, cool, we judged your choices in the game and now that's the end of it. Nope, it's more of like a, we judged you, now you judge us kind of situation. I could have found a nicer way to say that, but meh. Let's loop back to the beginning of the game and look at the tutorial again. The trolley question we're answering might not be exactly on point, it is showing the kind of choices you're going to be making. The first question is about going on vacation, and this can be seen as like playing a game. Are you new to the game or playing again? Or it can also be playing in a new way or a familiar way. And then we're asked how to feel about being sentenced to death, which is related to the hard choices we're going to be making about our own life. And then the rest are just making choices between letting people die, live, or left alone, which will result in death. Now, I have issues with the utilitarianism of the trolley problem, but it makes sense for the game. Classically, the utilitarian view would be to steer the train to the track with one man on it. This is often viewed as the morally permissible option. Alternatively, it could be seen that interaction with the track would be wrong, since now a person who redirected the track is now responsible, when previously no one would have been at fault. To me, this trolley question is just a calculation of human morality for the most powerful to use to validate their fundamentally flawed decisions. Alex and Morgan are the ones that control the train. Without the escape pods, the people have no way off the station. Their free will was taken from them and put in the hands of Alex, which has his own agenda. No matter what our choices are, the train keeps rolling. My problem with the trolley question is that the option to stop the train isn't present. If you ask to stop the train, you're always told you can't, but that simply isn't true. For the story, wiping out all the Typhon neuromods and its research, along with all the Typhon, would be stopping the train. Alex made it very clear throughout the story that he doesn't want to stop the research. Neither does the board or Cosma, the rival for TranStar. None of them want to stop the train. Even the developers want it. They all want the train to keep rolling, but they still believe there's a morally valid reason for their choices. Only a few people die, so others can live longer, better lives. The problem I have is that it isn't just a few people. Then there's the introduction of the Fat Man to the question, and this adds deliberate harm to the equation. This is coming from the push the Fat Man achievement you get for killing Alex. My dispute with their use of it is that Alex had the power to stop the train a long time ago, but he didn't. He isn't an innocent bystander like the Fat Man traditionally is supposed to be. And I get this might be calling Alex fat as a joke, but it disregards the purpose of the Fat Man in the trolley problem that they set up. What I am arguing is that Alex and Morgan suck ass, and we're riding the train right through the populations of man long before our efforts to divert it. Again, I know this whole board was in control, but Alex could have done something a long time ago. Wait, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, simulation in a simulation. It really brings a lot of the smaller points being made throughout our tutorial experience together. It also makes for nice replayability. While I'm sure a portion of the simulation was real in the video game sense, they probably added opportunities for the Typhon to learn empathy. Whatever the canon conclusion of the events on Talos were, Alex survives. I suspect Morgan used the null wave device and they continue the research on Talos. The main reason I believe this is because Alex is still in his Talos jumpsuit. Why would he be wearing it if he wasn't on the station, or at the very least in space? The scientists also had their consciousness transferred over to the operator droids, so they likely survived the events on Talos too. When it comes to the Typhon escape in Earth, that could have happened a dozen times leading up to the events of the game and after. And there's even a chance the Mimic was hiding away in one of the escape pods from the moon base when it crashed to Earth. Whatever the real reason they escaped to Earth, it would have happened eventually. The Moon Crash DLC is the only DLC for Prey. It takes place on a spy satellite orbiting the moon. We play a hacker named Peter who works for Kazma. Once again, Kazma is not important. They just are a company from Thailand that doesn't do very well, but competes with Transstar, apparently. Probably due to monopoly laws, Transstar allows them to exist. That's what I'm guessing. Peter is tasked with spying on the moon base, but really we're just reliving the final moments of the 5 different survivors. The Typhon escape in Talos happens at the same time, so there isn't much time discrepancy. Each character is limited in which neuromods they can use, but there are some cool unique powers to the DLC, and I am not really interested in any of these. Loot is random in the simulation, so you can find heavily upgraded weapons just right at random. Depending on what you find, the runs can be either difficult or easy, but you can make them easy if you just bring the right gear. All the weapons have durability, but if you are used to using these modifiers on the actual base Prey game, then this won't be a problem for you. The rarity is based on how many upgrades the weapon has. Even the wrench has upgrades here, something I wish we had in the base game. There are a number of things called Typhon gates in different areas. Normally these won't open there if there's a Typhon nearby, or if you have a Typhon neuromod installed, but there's a bypass. If you shoot the computer with a disruptor or an EMP, it'll disable it for a few seconds, and this is probably the easiest way to move around the station, so it's always good to have a disruptor weapon with you. To finish the DLC, you need to escape with all 5 characters in a single run, but time is somewhat limited. You have to avoid your corruption from reaching level 5, or you'll have to redo the simulation. You can also find these time reverse things that help a bit, but they're kind of rare. You pretty much have to know what you're doing for each of the characters, and this means you need to plan your runs, as each character runs the same areas. If you loot everything you see, you won't be leaving anything for your next characters. I suggest you just grab the items you actually need to complete your goals and leave everything else behind. You wouldn't want to take a med kit that you don't end up needing, and then you might need it on a different person. And there's also added status effects like bleeding and burns, but if you've played with the modifiers, you're used to these. These have specific items you need to actually cure them with, as they hinder your ability to move or do certain actions. One might make it impossible to sprint, while the other causes damage when you sprint. The only thing that I don't find too bad are concussions, but the only thing it really does is prevent neuromod installations, so you'll have to cure it before you leaving a run if you have any neuromods in your inventory. There are some new weapon mods, but more importantly new weapons. You can find this laser blade that would have been real cool to have on Talos. It's supposed to be designed to allow for live Typhon dissection and other studies. It's pretty much just like a psychic dagger that can cut through walls. And another one is this glue charge. It's just a glue gun but in a grenade. It pretty much works as you think it does. It's nothing special. And the last one is this Typhon spore. It creates a Typhon node that releases tentacles and attacks things. It's a very destructive weapon, but I'm really not a fan of it. It's a little too aggressive for my taste, and it just kind of breaks the game a little bit, but not really at the same time. I don't like it. One of the characters you play as is Riley Yu. She is Morgan and Alex's cousin. Alex calls her during the simulation to tell us that Talos is having problems and he will see her Earthside, hopefully. Alex says in the call to Riley that only the Yu family can save Earth. The family seems to have a superiority complex. Earth wouldn't have been having a problem with Typhons if they didn't go down the path that they were going with the human-fed Typhon species things. Really, a lot of the problems could have avoided if the Soviets just spent their time to work on the plans to control the station and never got the USA involved. I guess the Soviets were just too incompetent, nothing like the strong United States of America. Capitalists love capitalizing on a problem that they created so they could sell a solution. And if people never know they caused the problem, everyone's going to love them for fixing it. Rye the U transfers her consciousness over to a droid and escapes the station with the data from the moon base on it. While traveling off the moon base, it's intercepted by Peter. I'm going to be real, Peter got the short end of the stick. This is because Kazma decides to just force Peter to destroy all the data on his satellite after completing the simulations. He has his family and some backstory, but I didn't really pay attention to it. In fact, I found it hard to spend too much time reading everything due to the corruption timer, so I really didn't get invested in any of the characters. The DLC is a fun experience, but the game loop can get a bit stale at times, and I would suggest it, but it takes a while to get to where you need with all the characters to complete the DLC, so it's a bit grindy. I really don't have too much else to say about the DLC. It's well designed and has a lot of replayability, but it's an investment. Unlike subscribing to a YouTube channel, all that requires is a click to the subscribe button. And you made it this far, so why not just subscribe? Alright, now that I'm done selling my soul out to the YouTube gods. Prey was a game released with mixed reviews. One I was reading was from GameSpot, shortly after its release. Their main issue and complaint was gameplay issues, but I played in 2022, so I don't really have these problems. I didn't have that many glitches, and I refused to look at my friendship with the telepath as a glitch. I did experience one major glitch where I somehow failed a mission with 37 and he wouldn't interact with me. One of their complaints was about unengaged missions and loose story threads that aren't interesting, but I don't necessarily agree with this. The loose narrative threads and unengaged missions lead into each other and form a story that just needs to be pieced together. The idea is that the station was damaged, and with all the security measures, of course you're going to not find deep explanations about what's going on. You're forced as an unknown participant to piece together and learn about things. It's not that all the story threads lead somewhere, it's just some things can be fun. They also complain about the resources in the game, that the Typhons soak up a good amount of damage, so you end up dumping ammo into them. This makes survival difficult since you used up all your resources for ammo rather than other things. This to them is bad, but again, I don't agree. This is a thing called resource management, and it adds tension to the experience. This is a good time for a person to learn how to be resourceful and to change up a strategy when times are rough. Stop shooting them and instead shoot one of those explosive canisters you see and find everywhere around the game. You can also just throw them at the Typhon. There are so many options to kill things that you won't even need to use a gun if you don't want to. I spoke about and showed many of them. At one point they criticized the sound of the mimics, saying they sound awkwardly timed, but they also missed the fact that these sounds indicate a mimic's actions. They wouldn't need to complain about getting hit in the back with a fucking mimic if they paid attention to the sounds they were making. The main point of an immersive sim is to have a bunch of options, and then to go back with a different set of skills and try a different approach to see what happens. A lot of the things are just not going to be openly accessible to the person. You're going to have to resource manage, you're going to have to piece things together. You don't know what's happening on this destroyed station with all these locked doors. You have to figure it out. Alex and the other scientists are working with the Typhon Morgan to look for specific traits, and by finding out they didn't make the most empathetic choices during the game, you can go back and get the perfect good ending. Or you go back and choose to kill everyone and get the bad ending. The point is, Prey has given you many different ways to complete your task, even if your task doesn't change. The main problem the person who wrote this article has is that they had a bunch of glitches, and that they weren't managing the resources well. Most people are going to have trouble focusing on a game if they're constantly having game-breaking glitches and their mistakes are haunting them. I mean, how many of us have played an immersive sim, realized we made a bunch of bad choices, and just restarted the game? That this is a normal way to play. I'm just really glad that I played this after the problems were fixed, so I had a good experience with the game. I think the most common complaint about Prey was it being lackluster compared to games like Dishonored and other immersive sims, and while I haven't gotten into the Dishonored very much, I feel like they are fundamentally different. Prey doesn't force the stealth mechanics on you in the same way Dishonored does, but of course, I disagree with people who are saying Prey falls short on this standard. Most of what Prey does is good enough together to make for a really great experience. Games don't always need to have some kind of innovation. Sometimes it's just good to get a game that does everything well together. Prey is by no means a perfect game. The voices don't line up with the mouths of the characters, and no one really looks that good. But it sounds good, and it has a style. I don't want to hang around this topic any longer since this video is long enough already. I was a really big fan of Prey. I'm on my third playthrough, and it's on Nightmare difficulty. It's a fresh start with modifiers. This is what I expect to be the most realistic version of Prey, one where getting hit with an explosive psychic blast actually kills you, the way it should be. Modern gaming has become this weird landscape where the best experiences come from games that have already been out for a while, when the developers have already worked all the glitches and patched all the release bugs that we've come to expect. Fucking greedy developers. Nowadays, we half expect a game to have problems on release, then they work them out over the next few months or years. Prey came out in 2017, and we really haven't seen much from the genre since. And there are a few games coming out in 2023, but we still have to wait and see. There is hope for Bloodlines 2, but I'm still not going to hold my breath on that one coming out next year. Getting excited for new titles can lead to raised expectations, and that can only lead to massive disappointment. I've already spoken about how I feel about Prey, but I just want to reiterate. Prey does a lot well and shines in environmental storytelling. It does fall short on size because after a while the station does feel kind of small. While being small, the large, more open areas become a chore to explore. Places like the Talos exterior have so many hiding places that once you are done looking around after your first playthrough, you probably don't want to do it again. If you don't remember where something is out there, you're not going to go look for it. I was able to finish most of the missions in the game that can be completed, but one frustrated me. There's a mission where you're supposed to find a body of a crew member that's supposed to be somewhere out in space. It's outside the boundaries of the station, but for the life of me, I can't find it. I've looked it up, and I've spent way too long looking for it. I've never found it. Besides this, most of the missions are fine. They help connect the story of what's happening on Talos during the escape of the Typhon. I've only had one major problem, and that was the 37. Even if I couldn't get in, I was still able to kill the guy for show, so it wasn't the end of the situation. The lack of cutscenes in the game was a great choice for the immersive genre. Not only does it free up development time, but it doesn't put the character in a position where they make choices the player wouldn't make themselves. By being very selective on where you put the cutscene and the information it contains, you aren't contradicting the player and their actions. It frees up a lot of that expensive development time for more of those choices. Yeah, they can be cool to watch, but you wouldn't want your murder hobo to suddenly have full conversations with a character only for them to escape during a cutscene. You know that if the situation wasn't in a cutscene, you would have killed them instantly. Not many games have the moxie to allow you to actually kill everyone you encounter, and that for me gives a few bonus points, which goes to nothing because I'm not scoring the game. Now I know I was kind of vague about the alternative history part, but no matter how much I explain in detail, people are gonna get angry. It's a touchy subject for Americans due to the fact that we learn an entirely different version of history. Also, communism bad because breadlines, no freedom, and other stuff. American history had this issue with certain topics like CRT and anything socialist. Some topics aren't even spoken about, like the internment camps or the slave labor prison camps. You know, those Japanese internment camps we had where most of the Japanese and Asian American population were shoved in Soviet-like gulags. And this isn't even including stuff like the Tulsa Race Massacre that many people learned from a television show like The Watchmen. What we learned about the USSR is either exaggerated, a lie, or happened once and they wrote about it like it was a normal thing. The USSR did make mistakes, but many of them are the same things the USA was doing and continues to do. The only difference between the situation is that the USSR did it under the banner of communism, and we all know how bad that's supposed to be. They even wrote about the Gulag still being active. Like, I'm not going to get into the Gulag topic since it is a prison system. The American prison system still uses slave labor, and the conditions are terrible. But Americans either deny this or just say that they're prisoners so they don't deserve better. But they will still condemn the Soviet system. It is possible that the US not involving themselves in foreign intervention could be enough to save the Soviet Union, but I'm not entirely sure about that. Liberalism had already infected the country with Khrushchev's new economic policies that predate even the events in the game. This infection is still minor. It will grow until a certain point with Gorbachev. And of course, this made room for Yeltsin to come in and consolidate power. And in the name of liberal democracy, he undemocratically went against the proletariat and broke up the USSR. American propaganda needs you to believe the Soviet Union are bad, that all their actions are of an evil authoritarian dictatorship, but if American opens up an internment camp or labor camp, it is just to protect liberal democracy. And people insult the Chinese government for lying to their people about history. When America does this, just to support some stupid redneck population. When Alex created the Typhon with Morgan's memories, he needed the Typhon to see that the staff on TranStar are worth saving. He really isn't looking for a Typhon that sees values in humans, but a Typhon that sees value in Alex's vision. Chose Morgan's memories because they were pretty much the only person who has Alex's visions and goals. Their parents tried to kill him, and the scientists aren't emotionally connected to Alex, making them poor choices for Alex's experiment. Morgan is the only person for the results he's looking for. The way the final question is framed isn't straightforward either. It doesn't take Alex's hand to save humanity like it seems at first. He never actually says anything about saving humanity, just their lives depend on it. Given the events and choices Alex made throughout the story, he really isn't interested in saving all of humanity, just a select few. He wants the Typhon to see the world the way Alex and Morgan did. If you agree to take Alex's hands, you'll hear him say,
We're gonna shake things up, like old times.
Nothing about his final statement should tell you that he plans to change. He isn't going to stop his research. Even when the Typhon overran the station and the moon base, he still wasn't interested in destroying it. Morgan and Alex are going to continue to shake things up like they used to. We just won't know what that'll look like. If they make a sequel to the game, we can see what the canon ending of the events were. Judging by the fact that companies want to make money, they're probably going to go with an ending that can continue into a new game. So they're probably going to pick the ending where Alex and the Typhon teamed up. Now, no doubt this will take place on Earth. I suspect we'll be playing as the Typhon with Morgan cells trying to deal with the Typhon on Earth. I'm just going to bet that Alex starts the game as an ally and ends the game as the antagonist. I have no doubt that he's going to try to stop the Typhon, but the end choices are going to be different. I predict you're going to be choosing to allow Alex to control the Typhon, or to prevent it by destroying them entirely. One way or another, I think Alex is going to be manipulating the protagonist throughout at least the first half or a good portion of the next game. I know a lot of people are going to come at me about certain topics in this video, but that is fine. I can use the activity on my channel. I'm sure there are a few American historians giving their version of the USSR, but I actually expect that. I grew up learning the American's perspective, and there's one thing it lacks, and that's nuance. I just find it regrettable that the only actual prisoner you can save is an American one. The Soviets were given literally nothing in classic American fashion. There are a few things I either forgot to mention or didn't really find the time to bring it up. One thing is being cigar boxes. You can collect used cigars, but there are boxes full of cigars that literally sit next to them half the time, but you can't loot them. I've wondered about this in a few games and if it's just like a reference or a joke, but I'm not really sure. There are a lot of other things that I either forgot to mention or decided to cut, but Prey is a great game, and I really do think it's must play. On an unrelated note, I started writing this on November 30th, this line right here, and I live in Canada. It's November 30th, and it's fucking heavily raining right now. It should be snowing.